In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Strange Bedfellows, episode 15. I'm your host, Laurie Spencer. Rick Walker has the night off. You probably noticed there was no Maverick News broadcast tonight. It's been a crazy week up there in Canada, and I think that Rick could use a little bit of R&R time. So I'm going to do my best to hold down the fort tonight with a really interesting guest. It's always a pleasure to have him with us. The great Caleb Maupin will be joining us this evening in a few, and we got a lot to talk about. Of course, we're going to touch on Nazigate, is what we're calling it up there in Canada, and all of the crazy developments this week and the fallout from that. Going to get Caleb's perspective on that. But, most of you already know Caleb. He's a regular on Maverick News and on Strange Bedfellows. But just in case you haven't caught him before, I think the last time he was with us was episode 9. I'll give you a little intro to tell you what Caleb does. He's an author. He's a reporter for RT Television in Russia, also a historian, a political activist, and founder of the Center for Political Innovation, CPI. And tonight we've got a lot to talk about. Caleb has a new book out. It's called Letter to Bob Avakian, and I've been reading it, really enjoying it. And Caleb's going to tell us what that's all about. Also, we're going to talk about some of his latest reporting for RT. He covers the United Nations and recently had an exclusive interview with the president of Iran, and also talked to Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister for the Russian Federation. So we're going to take a look at that. We're also going to talk about censorship because unfortunately, Caleb is the latest to feel the sting of censorship on YouTube. 115 of his videos were taken down by the platform just this week. So we're going to talk about that and a whole lot more. Something I'm particularly interested to talk to Caleb about, because he's a communist. I want to get his reaction and his thoughts on this rising tide that we see of fascism, of anti-Semitism, of anti-communism here in the 21st century. And I just want to find out where all this is leading us. As a historian, I'm pretty troubled by it. Is this taking us to World War III? Are we talking another genocide? Are we talking mass executions of communists like we did in the 20th century? Another Holocaust? Are the horrors of the 20th century repeating? And most importantly, can this dangerous momentum be reversed before it's too late for humanity? So without further ado, I'm going to bring in my good friend, Caleb Maupin. Hello, Caleb. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. How about yourself?
Well, I'm doing good. At least we aren't flooding here in Oklahoma. So fortunately, you're up on the 5th floor, so you're not underwater right now like a lot of New Yorkers are. What a crazy week. Tell us what those floods were like, man.
Well, for people who have basement apartments, which are pretty common in New York City, but, illegal, right? Because it violates the housing code. But there's a lot of people who live in basement apartments. It's not been a good week. A lot of flooding has happened. And a lot of it could have been prevented if the infrastructure of this city was properly up to date, which it is not.
Obviously.
So, this has not been a good week for New York City. I will say that I've noticed this for years, but, we have this huge subway system, which is actually the best subway system in the United States, but that's really not saying much here in New York City. But all it takes to derail it and make it just, completely slow down and in some cases stop is a bunch of rain. I mean, it's really weird. The New York City subway system can't withstand rain. There's been times I've been on my way to work and then a thunderstorm comes and it's like, all right, well, I better text my boss. I'm going to be an hour late. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just absolutely ridiculous that our train system is so fragile that all it takes is a lot of rain. I mean, one thing if there's a hurricane or a tornado or something, but the fact that the New York City trains, they just, it rains a lot. Oh boy, everything's coming to a grinding halt. Like that's unbelievable. And it's embarrassing in this day and age. And if you look at the trains they've got in China, the trains they've got in Russia, the Moscow subway system is amazing. It can withstand a thunderstorm or two, to say the least. So there you go.
Right. And you know what you're talking about because you've actually traveled to China and to Russia and you have witnessed it firsthand. And then you come back to New York City and you see this disaster. And it's just becoming increasingly common. It seems like every time Manhattan has a good rain, this happens and the subways flood and then the streets flood. And
this time
serious infrastructure problems in this country that need fixing.
Yeah, this time it was particularly bad because of the fact that, there was flooding. But I mean, sometimes all it takes is just a little thunderstorm and the trains are all delayed 15, 20, 30 minutes. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just utterly ridiculous. And, I talked to, college students and, like there was Chinese college students, they come to the United States and they're always just like, is this for real? Like, this is the richest city in the world. This is the home of Wall Street and the trains, the subway system is this bad. I mean, it's delayed, it's falling apart, and it smells like urine. Yeah. And like, what in the world is going on here? People just they find it really hard to believe. And what's interesting is many people think that the subways are government in New York City. That's a common misconception. They're not. They're actually private. The MTA is a public beneficent corporation. It's a for-profit corporation owned by the big banks, but facilitated by the government. It's got a government monopoly. Originally, the subways were private. And then, I believe in the 1950s, maybe even earlier than that, they nationalized them. They made them, public property. And then in the 70s, they sold them to the MTA, which is just a public beneficent corporation that is like a money laundering scheme for the banks, where the public spends money on it and the banks make profit. And if there's ever any expenses, the taxpayers have to pay it, and the banks make more profit. And it's like a ripoff scheme. And you look at the details of how the MTA is set up. It is just a great example of theft of the public budget, theft of taxpayer money by some of the wealthiest people in the world. And what do we get in exchange for it? Bad service that gets worse every year, it seems.
Right. And it's the same with our railroads across the country. Most of those are privatized. And so we get things like East Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and then there's a certain school of thought. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's talk a little bit. Oh, I'm so sorry. There seems to be a bit of a StreamYard delay going on tonight. We're having some technical difficulties. It seems that happens to us a lot. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your latest reporting for RT and the coverage that you do on the United Nations. You had a couple of really great gets this week or this past week, and you got to have a sit-down, one-on-one conversation with the president of Iran. Tell me about that.
Sure. Well, it was a kind of a surprise to me. But, at the end of the day, it kind of makes sense because I've been to Iran a number of times. I did get to witness a speech by the supreme leader of Iran, which was very moving. And I made a documentary film for Iranian television in 2015 that about me visiting Iran as an American and et cetera. And you can find that on the YouTube channel. So I'm appreciated in Iran, and the Iranians know me, and I guess they trust me. And RT wanted to have an interview with the Iranians. And long story short, I ended up being the guy to sit down with the president of Iran. It was a conversation. Now, there was a translator, and so it actually took a lot longer than the video that you're going to show because of the fact that there was a translator, but we had to edit it together. But it was the two of us. We sat there, and it was quite an exciting evening. I mean, it was very last minute, and there was a lot of making sure the president has everything that he needs, and and all of that. And it was done at the UN hotel. There's a floor of the UN hotel that the Iranians have for themselves when they bring their delegation, and the Secret Service was there, and the NYPD was there with their SWAT team to search us as we went in to make sure we weren't going to hurt the Iranians. And Yeah, it was quite an exciting ordeal. But very last minute, I got to sit down with the president of Iran, and I'm very honored to have done so. And I tried to ask him questions that were, meaningful. I mean, I started out focusing on the things that would be of interest to RT, about BRICS and Russia and such. But I also asked him about, about U.S.-Iran relations, about the protests that have happened. So it was a good conversation.
That was strange. Did I lose you, Caleb?
I'm right here, but I stopped talking and then I just heard silence. It seems like there's some kind of delay going on. Is that the case?
Yeah, there sure is. Well, I'm going to try and fix that while we roll this clip, see if I can get down to the bottom of what this issue is that we're having technically. But let's roll a few minutes of this interview, and you did ask him some great questions. I'm just going to start right here.
Iran has faced widespread criticism for its stance on the Ukraine conflict, with Kiev and its partners lashing out and criticizing Iran. What would you say to those who look
that the war between Ukraine and Russia needs to come to an end as soon as possible? Most decisively, it will be good for all the parties. If we want to understand what had caused this war, it is NATO's desire to expand its influence on more countries and establish its presence and set up military bases not only in Ukraine, but in many other states. Naturally, what we observe now happening is Ukraine seriously increasing its capacities thanks to America and Europe, above all in terms of the military aid it receives. Naturally, this only pushes it to continue the war. Let's see who is to benefit from a prolonged war. Is it Ukraine? Is it perhaps Europe? Or is it those who are praying today for this war to go on? I am convinced that with regards to this issue, the Islamic Republic of Iran, above all, stands for facilitating the end of this war, playing a mediator's role between Russia and Ukraine if possible. However, all those who are today sending all sorts of aid, including financial and military aid to Ukraine, do not wish to end the war. They wish to protract it by any means possible. The Islamic Republic of Iran, due to the ample opportunities it now has at its disposal, has been blamed by the West, which is trying to throw in more accusations. We have given our response to these accusations on different forums. We said, if you have something to back up these accusations, please produce it. They have not been able to produce a single piece of evidence or proof of any kind. Today, we have no doubt that their strategy is to keep accusing the Islamic Republic in order to disparage it and set public opinion against it. But this trick, just like all the other tricks they have used against the Islamic Republic, won't help them.
Now, Washington recently arranged the unfreezing of billions of dollars of Iranian funds that had been frozen in South Korea. But now, Washington is threatening to freeze these funds once again because they disapprove of how Iran may be spending this money. What do you make of these moves from Washington? What is their intent? Does this seem like erratic behavior? Is there a strategy behind what they're doing?
You see, it wasn't fair when the funds were frozen because they belong to the people of Iran. They shouldn't have frozen the funds. All the time the funds were frozen and the accounts arrested, this caused harm to the Iranian people. Now that the people of Iran again have access to these funds, we are spending them trying hard to take care of the needs of the Iranian people. But this American spirit of superiority, it was so typical of them to arrest our funds. Their sense of superiority allowed them to crack down on the Iranian people, to impose sanctions. Slapping nations with sanctions is so typical of the Americans and speaks of the uncurbed sense of superiority and tyranny that is at their core. Of course, Iran is a living witness of America's tyranny, both in terms of the American sanctions and in many other regards. I believe that our approach here and elsewhere involves perseverance, resistance, and standing our ground.
Now, I would like, if possible, for you to give us your assessment of the prospects and future of relations between Iran and Russia.
We have enjoyed long-standing relations with Russia in multiple areas, including politics, economics, trade, defense, and security. And our cooperation is developing every day. Even the war in the region couldn't slow down our cooperation in multiple areas. Quite the opposite. The political will that prioritizes expanding our cooperation, particularly in the areas of trade and economy, as well as our partnership in the International North-South Transport Corridor Initiative and regional cooperation, pursues the development of our relations. Today's issues have had no impact on the relationship between Russia and Iran and never will. Our relationship with Russia is of strategic importance, and no developments on the global scene can change that.
Now, we understand your time is limited and you have many affairs to take care of, so we have just one final question. It's been a year since Iran was marked by a huge amount of unrest. And it's pretty clear the United States was backing this unrest and that there was a huge amount of media demonization of Iran broadcast around the world in the aftermath and during this unrest. What would you say to those who have seen these reports in Western media and have a negative image of Iran in their mind as a result of these portrayals? What would you like them to know that they have not been told?
I think enough time has passed since then, a full year, so we can better see the situation, the setting, and what happened behind the scenes. Even those who had no information and were misled by the media and their false news can now see the facts and understand the essence of what happened. The United States and its European allies tried to ride the wave. They thought they could strike the Islamic Republic at that moment, on gender issues, for example, and on economic issues. They started a hybrid war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, but after a little while, we saw the Iranian people prevail in that war. So the Iranian people was victorious again. When I spoke at the UN, I said that the Iranian people had won this hybrid war and had been able to secure this victory in the situation created by Iran's enemies. The hostile media, psychological, economic, and political pressures. As you can see for yourself today, all the opponents, all the enemies of Iran, although they made an attempt to bring back at least the memory of the events of a year ago, they did not succeed. They failed completely. And the people who had any doubts that the enemies of Iran were behind this, the enemies who sought to put the Iranian Republic through hardship, can now see clearly that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a weak sapling, but a strong tree that will not bow under these blows. The roots of the Islamic Republic are very deep. They did not begin yesterday. Over the years, we have become accustomed to hearing what the United States, some other Western countries, and detractors have to say to the Islamic Republic. Each time, they give us 6 months. Since the victory of the Islamic Revolution, every year they say that in 6 months, the situation in the Islamic Republic will change. I suppose it has now been about 80 times 6 months since they started saying that. It has been demonstrated to them that the Islamic Republic is a powerful state, a state that is now stronger than ever. In the meetings I had with some of the media and political pundits during my 2 days in New York, they admitted that it has been proven to everyone that the Islamic Republic, in the words of yours truly, will not bow. And this time, just like previous times, they failed. I hope that this time they've realized that the Islamic Republic is a powerful state, and most importantly, that God Almighty is looking after us. And with the faith of our people, with their hopes and trust, as the leader of the Islamic Revolution has repeatedly emphasized, it is not lies that are the basis for the continuation of the revolution, but the faith and the hopes of our people. Indeed, the revolution continues because of the faith and hopes of the people, which I have shared with you and all the esteemed viewers today. And a nation that is beloved and faithful is indeed a religious nation, and a nation that has hope. And a nation that is beloved and faithful is indeed a religious nation, and a nation that has hope. There is hope for the future, and a very bright future.
That was excellent, Caleb.
Thank you.
That was really great. Good job.
Thank you.
Good job. You know, it's, of course, that's exactly why you'll never see that on mainstream media. You'll never see an interview like that on cable television or satellite TV in the United States, or even on YouTube. Isn't that one of the videos they took down off your channel?
Yes, it is. That was one of the 115 that were removed on September 25th. That is correct.
Unbelievable. And yet, the other video that I'd like to play is still up on your YouTube channel. You got to speak to Russian's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and I noticed that one is still up on your YouTube channel. Can you tell us why that one is still there and they haven't taken it down? Do you know?
Well, I took it from the official UN channel. That's all I did is I ripped the video of the press conference from the UN channel. So if this video were to be deemed a violation of YouTube's terms of service, they would have to then take down the UN YouTube channel, because all I did was ask a question, an official UN proceeding that was then broadcast on the UN channel. So this one survived, but it does seem like the other videos were removed immediately afterward. All of a sudden, I was getting a huge amount of traffic on this video. I think it's up to about 75,000 views. So because of that, all of a sudden, it was like immediately afterwards, they took down 115 other videos that I've done, all of which were RT reports. So it looks to me like they saw that video doing well. They didn't like it. They said, oh, darn, we can't take this one down. So what can we do? Well, let's go through and find any other videos on his channel we can remove. And so they did. And it sounds like YouTube was acting kind of like a spiteful person more than anything. But no strikes. No strikes, no warnings, which is interesting also, right? So I wonder what that's about. But, I'm just happy to have my channel. I'm staying on YouTube as long as I possibly can, but I can't count on it forever. I realize that. I'm on Rumble now. I'm on other platforms. So if one of these days they pull the plug, look for me on Rumble, look for me on Rockfin, look for me on Odyssey. I won't be disappearing just yet.
That's just, well, I believe it, because I too have had a channel taken down. I've had several of my videos removed, not for Russia content, but as you know, for RFK Jr. content. They don't like him either. I guess they consider him to be a Putin puppet, a Putin stooge, and therefore his misinformation must be censored. But I'm glad the Lavrov interview is still up. It's not exactly an interview. It's a press conference, right?
Yeah, I just asked a question.
Yeah, and it was a great question, too. You basically asked, is the U.S. at war directly with Russia? And I'm going to show people his response.
Now, when it comes to the recent attacks on Crimea, there was a U.S. reconnaissance plane that was spotted in the area, and this points to the fact that the USA could have been directly involved, providing data. In addition to that, we now have this promise from Biden to send long-range ATACMS missiles. So at what point does the United States become a partisan of this conflict? At what point does this actually become a direct conflict with the United States, not simply a proxy conflict via Ukraine? When do we define the United States as being involved?
There are legal norms pursuant to which a country is identified as being a direct party to hostilities, and we and Western countries are doing everything possible to avoid them, not to mention them. But the fact that they are effectively engaged in hostilities with us, using the Ukrainians as fodder, we see that those who are here present, those who have even the slightest interest in the huge flow of information that and analytical material that is emerging in connection with the Ukrainian situation, they know perfectly well that Americans and the British and many others are engaged in hostilities. They are waging war, first and foremost, through the deliveries of more and more volumes and quantities of weapons. Today, in the statement at the General Assembly, I mentioned the figures about $170 billion at least being invested in Ukraine alone. Against the backdrop, and statistics are also available to follow the promises, volumes, and timelines that the Western country provided to the Africans and other countries requiring assistance, first and foremost in terms of development and to address issues linked to climate change. One can compare this even slightly. There's no comparison. Consider the credits provided to developing countries with the IMF, the World Bank, and even the International Association for Development. Ukraine was provided with credits of approximately 700% of its quota. Nobody has ever done this, 700% of the quota. And Ukraine's debt is significant. And they have been allowed not to pay this until 2027. Such concessional and quick decisions are not taken were never ever taken with respect to any other country. But so on the weaponry, that's clear. Turning to instructors, that's also clear. There are training of instructors in Poland, in Germany, in the United Kingdom. I am certain that there are instructors working in large quantities on Ukrainian soil as well. And of course, there are many mercenaries there, many of whom are official officers, but the mercenary status allows them to avoid a crossing of that legal threshold. But special information on satellites. We read about the statements about Elon Musk and his Starlink company's position, but military satellites are working throughout. Intelligence aircraft are also located and identified in the air, and U.S. reconnaissance planes, U.S. and British reconnaissance planes, are not only helping to identify objectives and targets, but they are showing where our air defenses are working, so that next time they could help. So you can call this whatever you want to call this, but they are directly at war with us. We call this a hybrid war, but that doesn't change the reality.
Yep. Diplomatic, but very straightforward talk. Of course, we're at war. And one of the members of our Maverick News Network is actually in Crimea. Our correspondent there is Kevin Michelizi. He runs the American and Crimea channel. And all this week, he has not been able to get online. He has not been able to do his show because Crimea is under massive DDoS, denial of service attacks on their internet infrastructure. He has reported to us seeing American drones in the air, constantly encircling them. There seems to be a lot of chatter online from pro-Ukrainian accounts that something big is coming for Crimea. They seem to be anticipating a major attack coming soon, and Russia is taking it very seriously. I understand that they have basically shut off GPS and trackers, cell phone trackers in Crimea, and they're gearing up their defenses for a major attack. What do you think of that, Caleb?
Well, it's interesting because Seymour Hersh has written that basically the war is already over and Russia has won. They're not going to be driven out of Crimea or the new republics. Meanwhile, I am heartened to see what just happened on the floor of Congress, that the House of Representatives passed a 45-day spending bill that did not include any money for Ukraine. And that it passed, because they didn't want to have a government shutdown. However, in an attempt to prevent it from being passed, Congressman Jamal Bowen from New York decided to pull the fire alarm in a congressional building.
That was crazy. I saw that. My God.
I mean, if our opponents are that desperate, it shows that I think we're on the winning end. And, Zelensky came to the United States for the UN General Assembly, and he was expecting that he was going to get another big, carpet rolled out for him. They were going to have him before Congress. And they said no. And Kevin McCarthy said no. He said he's not the president of the United States. He doesn't have the right to do that. They had a closed meeting with him. And it seems like suddenly what was a kind of a fringe position that we heard from Marjorie Taylor Greene and a few other people that really this isn't our fight, we should stay out of it, America first, has now become a quite mainstream position among Republicans. Now many Republicans are saying, yeah, why are we unloading all this money for Ukraine while at home so many things are not working out so well? And I am quite optimistic to see that. We'll have to see if the government ends up shutting down, if the U.S. Senate approves this budget, but I think that, things are starting to change. The tide is starting to turn, and it has a lot to do with that Canadian Nazi gate. People like you and I, Lori, we've been seeing stuff like that happening this whole war. However, this time the mainstream media noticed it. And that's what I think is important about the fact that this Nazi collaborator, Ukrainian nationalist, whatever, spoke before the Ukrainian, or the Canadian Parliament. Now it seems like the fact that, the Prime Minister of Canada has had to come out and apologize about it, it's turning into a bigger scandal. That seems to show that what you and I have been saying all along is now getting some mainstream play, and that gives me hope. So I certainly hope this big attack on Crimea doesn't come, or if it does, it's quickly repelled by Russia. I have no doubt in their ability to defend themselves. I've been to Crimea myself, by the way. I went to the Yalta Economic Forum in 2017. Great experience, beautiful beaches, amazing hotels, got to walk around and talk to people in Crimea. It was a great experience. A lot of beautiful pine trees and a lot of beautiful beaches and ocean out in Crimea. So I hope someday I can return when things are peaceful. I'd like to visit Crimea once again.
Well, when you do, I hope you and Kevin get to have lunch. He's a great guy. And he's been trying to get you on his show, actually. He's done an amazing, I think it's like a 31-part series about the history of the USSR.
Nice.
And it's really, really good. I hope you get a chance to check it out. All of our viewers should definitely watch that. And, I do want to talk about your new book, which I'm enjoying. I apologize. I have not finished it yet. Haven't had much time for reading. I think I'm up to chapter 5. So you're going to have to fill me in on some things without spoiling the end. Okay.
Sure.
But the name of the book is Letter to Bob Avakian.
Yes.
And a lot of our viewers might not be familiar with Bob Avakian. Can you tell us who he was and why you wrote him this letter?
Well, communism is kind of a fringe view in America. But recently, in the last decade or so, there's been a much bigger increase in people that are interested in it. And the leader of one of the most visible communist groups in America that is very out there. They have a chain of bookstores. They sell their newspaper a lot. They're very visible in your face in the name of communism. It's called the Revolutionary Communist Party. And the leader is a guy named Bob Avakian, who was a leader of Students for a Democratic Society back in the day, was a Bay Area activist, and he's formed this communist group. And his organization is neutral on Ukraine. They're neutral. They neither Washington nor Moscow. They kind of tend to blame Russia for it, but they're critical. They don't want to escalate to World War III. And so I decided that I would write this book because as so many younger people are getting interested in communism, he is going to be one of the people they come across. The group makes a really big point of promoting him on a personal level. They talk about building a culture of appreciation for their leader, Bob Avakian. So they promote his writings, his speeches, etc. So I thought that by writing this book, I could be a part of that conversation too. And I could, praise his accomplishments and what he's achieved over the years, because he has done quite a few admirable things, but also point out why his ideology and his worldview that kind of puts him as neutral between Russia and China and the United States. I don't think that's correct. And I also had the opportunity to reveal, some information about him that was presented to me, namely that he is an asset of French intelligence, which is kind of the big bombshell in the book, as well as the fact that during the late 1970s, his organization was heavily infiltrated by the FBI. And it was used to kind of intimidate Jimmy Carter against setting and establishing diplomatic relations with China. And both of those revelations that are well documented are quite important to point out, especially in light of everything that's been going on in Africa in regards to France, losing control of various African countries, in regards to NATO, et cetera, as well as, when we talk about, divisions in the American ruling class about foreign policy, et cetera, and infiltration of various organizations. So the book covers a lot of ground, and it's not a hit piece. I didn't write this to tear him down or destroy him. And I spend probably the first couple chapters, as you read, praising him and his accomplishments. This is an 80-year-old man who's done a lot of good things in his life, and he's held a group of people together. Back in the 70s, many different communist organizations were formed, and most of them dissolved after a decade or so. His group is still here, so that's admirable. And, they've done a lot to support Mumia Abu-Jamal to prevent his execution, a lot to raise the issue of police brutality when it was certainly not a trendy issue to talk about. Now it's pretty widely discussed, but it wasn't in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. So he deserves recognition for that. But also, if he's a genuine communist, he should be supporting Russia and China right now. He should be supporting He should be supporting the people of the world rejecting the domination of the United States. And he shouldn't be, taking orders from the French imperialists, which seems to be the case. And I make a pretty strong case for that in the book.
Yes, you do. And I'm curious because you talk about this a lot on your live streams, how the FBI infiltrated, was it back in the 50s or 60s, the Communist Party of the United States, the CPUSA. And also, you talk about that a lot in your book, how they infiltrated Bob Avakian's group. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how they did it and why they did it?
Well, the FBI had this program that is now widely discussed because of the Black Lives Matter thing. People now talk about COINTELPRO. But what does COINTELPRO stand for? Right? It stands for Counterintelligence Program. And the reason that Black activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton and Malcolm X were targeted in COINTELPRO, the same program that targeted the communist groups, was because the position of J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the FBI was that the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle and the various communist groups and the peace movement, he considered that to be a foreign intelligence operation. He considered that to be a conspiracy from Russia and from China. And so on those grounds, he sent the FBI to viciously go after the Communist Party, the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, peace groups, etc. And that was one of the main activities of the FBI. And, in the late 70s, when Jimmy Carter was president, you had the Church Committee, which was almost kind of like a Truth and Reconciliation for the 1960s, in which they admitted in congressional record and had congressional hearings admitting to all of this behavior of the COINTELPRO program that went on. Now, in regards to the Communist Party of the United States, in 1948, the National Board of the Communist Party was prosecuted. It was 20 people that were members of the Communist Party's National Board, and they were prosecuted under federal law for conspiring to not to violently overthrow the American government, but to teach an ideology that would necessitate and lead one to the conclusion that you should overthrow the government. And the language of the law that was used, it's called the Smith Act, which was a law that was passed in 1940. They didn't have to actually prove that they'd ever talked about overthrowing the government. All they had to prove was that they had taught an ideology, communism, which could lead one to that conclusion. So it was a particularly ridiculous conviction.
It was.
They were sent to prison for basically things that Marx and Lenin said. That was what the prosecution
They were like the January 6th protesters of their time, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, and the CNN actually made that analogy after January 6th. They argued January 6th. Yeah, they wrote an article comparing the trial of the Communist Party in 1948 to January 6th, which is just outrageous. Wow. But yeah, so the National Board of the Communist Party was thrown in jail. And then many states around the country had criminal communism or criminal syndicalism laws that outlawed the Communist Party. And so the Communist Party was basically forced to become an underground organization from about 1948 until 1957. However, they were underground and they were functioning in secret and, et cetera. But during those years, they still managed to do some pretty amazing things, like the Henry Wallace presidential campaign of 1948. I mean, the Communist Party was outlawed and suppressed, but they still managed to staff and organize a major presidential campaign that split the Democratic vote in 1948. And they organized something called the Civil Rights Congress, which was a legal organization that fought for the rights of Black people. The Department of Justice labeled the Civil Rights Congress a communist front organization. The Civil Rights Congress wasn't able to put up bail for anyone who was charged because they got this label on them, but they still functioned and had protests for Black freedom. A member of the Communist Party, William L. Patterson, was brought to the United Nations by the Soviet Union to present a petition accusing the American government of genocide against Black people. And so even though they were an illegal organization and they were functioning in the shadows, they managed to do a lot to talk about civil rights, to organize peace marches and oppose the Cold War, even though the FBI was chasing them around, and anyone who publicly got up and said, I'm a member of the Communist Party, was being prosecuted. But then we all know that Stalin died.
53, right? 1953 is when he died.
Stalin died. And there was some confusion in the Soviet Union about who was going to come later. But then in 1956, Khrushchev got up at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And basically, it was clear he was going to be the new leader. And he gave a tirade against Stalin, the infamous secret speech, much of which has been debunked. Some of the stuff is so ridiculous at the time that people at the time even said this is silly. Like, one of the claims was that Stalin was so scared when Hitler had invaded that he started crying and hid under his desk in fear. And it's like, anyone who knows anything about Stalin knows that's ridiculous. Stalin was a bank robber at one point. You know, this is a guy who would walk into banks with a firearm and rob people at gunpoint. So you think he hears about an army thousands of miles away and he just breaks down. I mean, that's ridiculous, you know. And that a lot of the things Khrushchev said just didn't have any factual basis. But regardless, that was Khrushchev sending a message to the United States that this guy who came before me, Stalin, he was a hardliner. He was going to challenge you, but I'll negotiate with you, right? I'll compromise. And there was a feeling among the American government that they did want to negotiate with Khrushchev, and that they were more worried about Mao and the African revolutionary movements. They were more concerned about these radicals around the world that were getting Soviet support to fight the American government. And they were hoping that they could convince Khrushchev that if the USA would get friendlier with the Soviet Union, he would de-escalate some of the support to these, you know, third world communist revolutionary movements. He would maybe get China to back down on some issues. So the attitude was, Stalin, he's gone, but this new guy we can possibly work with. And so then in 1956, right after the secret speech, the Communist Party of the United States suddenly had a public meeting. For the first time in decades, they had a public event, a national committee meeting, where they announced that the secret speech was indeed real. And then they published a document called Communists Take a New Look, announcing that they were going to have a convention, a public convention in 2 years, to decide whether or not they would drop communism completely and just become a mass party of socialism, dissolve, or whatnot. Then, shortly after that public meeting happened, then the U.S. Supreme Court legalized the Communist Party with the Yates versus the United States ruling, where
Very
this guy,
important.
this guy who'd been a member of the Communist Party, his name was Yates, I think Dennis Yates, something like that, and he'd been a member of the Communist Party, but he proved in court, even though he was a member of the Communist Party, he had never advocated the violent overthrow of the government. And he said, look, just because I join a group that doesn't advocate the overthrow of the government, that doesn't mean I should go to jail for advocating the overthrow of the government. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, actually, as long as the Communist Party doesn't advocate the violent overthrow of the government, they're allowed to exist. So the Supreme Court then legalized the Communist Party. Well, that was clearly done as a gesture to Khrushchev. It was a gesture to Khrushchev. You're allowed to exist. You can exist, but ever since then, when they came back into existence, and then in 1958, they had their convention where they endorsed Khrushchev and his condemnations of Stalin. At that convention, and since then, the Communist Party has been a very small organization, less than 2,000 members. And at this point, I mean, it's a couple hundred at most. But when they came back into existence, legally speaking, from 1956 onward, they were doing so under the direction of the FBI. And in fact, there was a member there was a guy who was on the national board of the Communist Party. His name was Morris Childs. And Morris Childs was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan for being an FBI informant and going back and forth to Moscow and bringing suitcases full of money back from Moscow to fund the Communist Party's activities and directing a network of informants that managed the Communist Party's affairs. So really, from about 1956 onward, the Communist Party has been more or less under the control of the FBI. That's not saying every person in it is an agent or something like that. That's not at all. It just means that their coming into existence as an organization was done with a U.S. federal agency saying, you're allowed to do this, but we're going to monitor your every move. We're going to make sure you do this and you don't do this. And that explains why the Communist Party has not really grown over the years, because if at any point they were to start growing and having an impact, the people, the federal agency that is overseeing them would step in and make sure that's not the case. And you can read about.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that the rank and file, the members of this Communist Party of the United States, were aware of the FBI infiltration, or were they unaware of the power that the FBI was exerting over their organization?
Oh, they were unaware. Absolutely. They were not told. But Morris Childs, who was on the national board, who knew Gus Hall, he knew all the leaders. He was an FBI informant, and he was regularly checking in with the FBI. Wow. And that there were mechanisms in place to make sure that the Communist Party never became an effective political organization. So much so
they were effectively neutered.
Yes.
During the Cold War. And when did they become aware of this infiltration?
I mean, I think they knew about it all along. I mean, they understood that. And my understanding is when they became a legal organization, once again, 1956, before the Yates ruling, which is interesting. But around that time, it was a matter of FBI agents going to the Communist Party members who had gotten out of jail and saying to them, okay, we've decided you can operate now, but you can have your office on this street. And you can, I mean, it was almost like they were basically being told, okay, we've changed the rules. You're allowed to exist, but we're going to monitor what you do. And many of them were still on parole at that point. You have to remember they had gone to federal prison for some of them 4 or 5 years, and they were all still kind of on parole. They weren't even really allowed to talk to each other, but they all apparently got a visit from the FBI. It said, we've changed the rules. You're allowed to be the Communist Party again, but you're going to do it with our oversight. And it's particularly wild to look at that history. And I don't doubt, I mean, Gus Hall really was very much a communist in his heart and soul. He believed in what he was doing. And, he made a contribution as a leader of the labor movement. And then as someone who campaigned for peace and for civil rights. And they were doing the best they could. That doesn't mean they're all bad people, but yes, they were effectively neutered by the FBI from about 1948 onward. Their existence was at the whim of the Department of Justice.
I remember Gus Hall because I'm old. I remember he ran for president in 1984. And I think that was the last time the Communist Party ran a candidate for president. They always had a candidate for president historically, I think every year, except I think during the Roosevelt years, because they didn't want to oppose Roosevelt. Did they?
They ran somebody. Yeah, they ran Earl Browder in 36.
It was Earl Browder.
Yeah. And, Gus Hall, 1984 was their last presidential campaign. But in 1984, Walter Mondale, I believe that was the candidate, right? Walter Mondale.
Yeah, he was a Democratic candidate. Mm-hmm.
He apparently called Gus Hall on the phone during that campaign. And Gus Hall considered that to be like a huge crowning achievement that Walter Mondale had called him on the phone during the campaign. They had a short phone call to discuss the possibility of some kind of foreign action with the Soviet Union, impacting the election results. And Gus Hall considered that to be like the highest moment of his career. And he said to his staff, like, this is proof that we are a really, really important part of the peace movement and the effort for, the Democratic camp in the United States against Reagan fascism. And that was their arguments. They argued that Reagan was a fascist, conservative. And even when they did run their own campaigns, they were still campaigning for the Democrats. They would run their candidate, but it was like, we're telling you to vote for the Democrats. It was a recruiting drive. Their campaigns were kind of a recruiting drive, and their speeches that they would give as the campaign would be focused on the Republicans. And they would say, well, the essence of our campaign is to defeat the Republicans. So, they didn't expect to get huge amounts of votes. There were a couple times, though, where they, 1976, they got a very significant number of votes. And one of the people who voted for them was John Brennan, Obama's CIA director.
That's right. Yes.
So that's wild. Right. And it was probably just because there were a lot of young people that were influenced by the protests and radicalism that wanted to vote. And they saw a communist that's against the establishment and voted for them. Charlene Mitchell, who was their candidate in 1968, I believe she got a significant amount of votes because of the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers being popular and such. And, Angela Davis was a household name, when she was leading the Communist Party, when she was on trial. And then afterwards, she became kind of the primary face of the Communist Party as Gus Hall got older. And Angela Davis, she was an academic who joined them and lost her job at, UCLA for joining them. And was very much kind of their public face throughout the 70s and 80s before resigning.
I remember.
So, yeah, I mean, the Communist Party it's important to know their history. I actually wrote a short book, kind of a history of the Communist Party, just kind of give people an overview.
Just in the United States, the Communist Party USA, right?
Yes. Yeah. And it's a fascinating history. And honestly, I tell people there are only really two communist groups in American history that have ever really mattered. And that's the Communist Party from like the 1930s up into the 1950s when they got crushed, and the Black Panthers. Every other communist group, maybe they did one thing good here or there, but they really didn't make that big of an impact. But the Communist Party and the Black Panthers, they made a significant impact on U.S. society. They got stuff done. And in the 1930s, during the Roosevelt years, the Communist Party, they had 2 city council seats here in New York City. They had 2 members of the House of Representatives that were probably members, Vito Marcantonio, and then there was another guy in Minnesota. I can't remember his name. And the Black Panthers, it's a similar story. They controlled certain neighborhoods around the country. They were loved by the Black community. They ran services and had a lot of influences. So if you want to look at kind of a case study in success, I would urge people, if they study the history of the Communist Party and study the history of the Black Panthers. The other groups are interesting, and they all did something good at one point, or they got something done. But for the most part, they haven't really accomplished that much. But those 2 are the ones to really study.
Well, of course, the point of Strange Bedfellows is sort of opposites attract. I'm not a communist, as you know. I'm a libertarian, but I'm not an anti-communist. I don't hate communism or communists. Unfortunately, too many of my fellow libertarians do. But I recognize the great strides and the great things that the communists did for American society. I'm not talking about Russia, not talking about China or North Korea. I'm talking about the United States. And certainly in terms of the labor movement in the early to mid 20th century, I'm often telling a lot of my libertarian friends who are anti-communist, I'm like, do you have a job? Yeah. Do you enjoy Labor Day? Do you like your holidays? Yeah. Do you like your 8-hour work day? Yeah. Do you like your benefits package? Yeah. All those things that you have as a laborer, all those protections that you have at your job and your paid holidays and sick leave and all those good things, you can thank a communist for that. Let's be honest, folks.
These auto workers out on strike in Michigan, who built the United Auto Workers? This is a great book here, The Communist Party and the Auto Workers Union by Roger Kieran. It's a very good book about the history of the United Auto Workers. I mean, it was, Homer Martin and Bill McKay and Communist Party members who largely are responsible for unionizing General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and the Flint sit-down strike of 1937, that people say was like labor's Gettysburg. It was like the turning point for industrial unions in this country. Who were the people occupying the plant? That was Communist Party members, card-carrying communists who did that.
And I also say to my friends who are anti-communist, I'm like, do you like the fact that Black people have rights now, that they can vote? And they say, sure. And I say, well, you can thank a communist for that too.
Yeah.
The civil rights struggle, and part of the reason that J. Edgar Hoover targeted Dr. Martin Luther King was because he was, suspected of being a tool of Russia, of the communists, and that this whole civil rights movement was just a big communist conspiracy, according to Hoover. But, we really do have the communists to thank for that, the civil rights movement. And also, tell us a few things that if you could sit down and talk to an anti-communist, a Republican, a libertarian, what would you tell them to thank a communist for in terms of our society? How did the Communist Party of the United States make our lives better?
Well, I mean, if you're talking specifically about the Communist Party of the United States, any steel worker, any industrial worker, I keep hearing this, that it's a thing I hear. I heard it in Trump's recent speech to the auto workers. I heard it from Steve Bannon many times, is people have it in their heads that jobs in heavy industry are just magically good paying jobs, right? And you hear, well, we need those good jobs to come back because those jobs are just good. And like jobs in fast food or retail, they're just naturally low wage jobs. What people forget is that until the 1950s, really, jobs in steel mills and jobs in auto plants, they tended to not pay very well. And it wasn't until the Communist Party organized them and organized sit-down strikes and occupied the factories and got unions. And then after World War II, they were able to launch the post-World War II strike wave. And amid the post-World War II economic boom, it wasn't until then that industrial workers in the United States got the very comfortable lifestyle that they once had. And so, it's nothing magical about these jobs. And I don't see any reason why fast food workers or retail workers couldn't have that today, but we'd have to have a strong labor movement, right? It's I tell people that there's nothing that we have that we haven't fought for, right? The bosses don't give anything away. Food stamps. It was the Communist Party during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was no food stamps. People were starving and hungry on the street. And the communists organized these unemployment councils that would go and occupy government buildings and harass elected officials. They organized hunger marches of thousands and thousands of people. Here's something: veterans benefits. Right? Do you know anyone who receives veterans benefits? Well, you can thank the communists for that, because they organized something called the Bonus Army. 1931.
1932.
Yes, thousands and thousands of veterans went to Washington, D.C. and occupied the National Mall demanding the payment of veterans benefits. And that's why
who led that march?
What do you mean?
General Smedley Butler, right?
Yes, indeed. And that there were communists that were involved, and communists, James W. Ford and other communists were heavily involved in making that rally happen. And that, the Communist Party, they are a significant force to be reckoned with. Also, the contribution in terms of art and culture, I think, should be celebrated. Charlie Chaplin was very much a fellow traveler and friend of the Communist Party. A great, beloved American filmmaker.
And boy, did he suffer for it. He too was targeted during the Red Scare, and they ran him out of the country.
Yeah, the first play on Broadway advocating LGBT rights was called The Children's Hour, and it was written by Lillian Hellman, who was also viciously targeted during the McCarthy period and blacklisted. But it was a play about two women who run an orphanage, they run an orphanage, and they're gay, and they're basically forced out of the position because people suspect them to be child molesters or something like that. And it just shows how the homophobia kind of destroyed their lives, and that was quite a controversial play back in the 1930s.
It was strange the way that they equated people who were communists with being homosexual. That was always the strange thing about the Cold War I never quite understood.
Well, and actually, it's particularly strange because, Stalin outlawed homosexuality. It was illegal in the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party, officially, their rule was that anyone who was gay was not allowed to be a member. They did not enforce that. They generally didn't enforce that, but that was their position. And until about the 1980s, most communists in the world maintained that homosexuality was a disease from capitalism. They claimed, if you went to the Soviet Union, you asked about gay people, they'd say, we don't have that here. That's from capitalism. We don't have that. You went to Cuba, they would say the same thing. It wasn't until, the 1970s, you started to see the gay rights movement, and East Germany was kind of the beginning of LGBT rights in the communist world. And, now, Cuba has gay marriage, and Fidel Castro actually gave a very heartfelt apology for the mistreatment of gay people in Cuba. That was, it was really significant. And in the early 90s, they made a film. It's a really beautiful Cuban film. I don't know if you ever heard of it, called Strawberry and Chocolate. Do you know this film?
Heard of it. Never seen it.
Well, it came out in the 90s, and it is a Cuban film it's about an elderly man in Cuba who's an intellectual and kind of a nonconformist, and he's gay, and he befriends a young man who's a very loyal member of the Young Communist League and the Communist Party. And it's about the argument that this very young man and this older gay man have. And eventually the tragedy of the film is that the older gay man ends up defecting from Cuba and leaving. And the message of the film is that Cuban society was not tolerant and not friendly to people like this guy who were intellectually nonconforming or gay, and that it was really sad that Cuba didn't have a place for him. And that film was widely shown, and it won a lot of awards. And that was basically the Cuban government saying, in light of the fall of the Soviet Union, it wasn't just about gay people. It was also about intellectuals. And it was kind of like, the Soviet Union, part of the reason they fell is that they lost a layer of people that were from the more educated layers of their society, and that some of the reforms in Cuba were about kind of maintaining the loyalty of intellectuals and others. And that's a very powerful film. But a big point of the film is that older man is not just an intellectual, not just an educated man. He's also gay. And that, he has to be in the closet about being gay. And so it's very interesting to think about as well. And it's again, I hear both sides, right? I hear that homosexuality is all communist, that the LGBT movement is communist. And I say to people, I hear that from conservatives a lot. And I say to them, they're not into the transgender thing in China. They're not into the transgender and all this stuff that you're mad about. I don't see that happening in communist countries.
Exactly right.
But then I also hear people that are leftists and woke say, well, communist governments murder gay people and persecute them. And I say, whoa. The leader of the first gay rights organization in American history was Harry Hay, who was a Communist Party member. Lillian Hellman, she wrote the first pro-LGBT play on Broadway. And, it was especially, in the 70s and 80s, it was communist organizations that were, pushing the LGBT stuff. So it's complicated. The answer to that question is it's complicated, right? And as you pointed out, I mean, the Red Scare in the United States after the Second World War, people point out it was also the Lavender Scare. And that's when they passed a law that no gay person could work for the State Department because gay people might be communists.
Yes, literally.
Yeah, and that Joe McCarthy was known to, bully people over allegedly being gay, used nasty language on the floor of Congress.
Yet his top counsel was Roy Cohn.
Right, and apparently
was gay.
He himself may have been gay as well, according to...
And the whole David Shine affair apparently was a gay affair.
The whole thing is particularly weird. So it's not one-sided. And that I've noticed that with anti-communism, in a lot of cases, it goes both ways. For conservatives, they have one line. For liberals, they have another line. But the message is the same: hate the communists. And the truth is much more complicated on a lot of these issues. And that's one example. Is the communist movement is it responsible for all homosexuality and all that? No. Is the communist movement viciously homophobic and hateful? No. It's much more complicated than that.
That's right. And I do want to dig down a little bit more on the Red Scare, because here we are again in the 21st century repeating. I guess we're in Red Scare number 3, because we had the first Red Scare after the First World War, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. People in the West got very nervous that, these communists might come overthrow our government. And so that's where it all began. You had the Palmer raids of 1920 and 21, where they rounded up and deported hundreds of Russians, just kicked them out of the country and sent them to Russia, suspecting that they might be communists, whether they were or whether they weren't. And then we did it again after World War II, which has always been both fascinating and puzzling to me, because we helped the Soviet Union defeat the Nazis in World War II. And before the war was even over, we had turned on our ally, the Soviet Union. You had Winston Churchill's Operation Unthinkable, this crazy idea he had to use repurposed Nazi soldiers fighting side by side with American and British soldiers. He planned to invade the Soviet Union again. It was going to be Operation Barbarossa Part 2. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and we did not actually do that. But that's when the Cold War really began. We did, in fact, recruit so many Nazis, Nazi scientists, Nazi spies, Nazi soldiers, and we brought them over to our shores here in North America. And it was immediate, almost immediate after the war, that this, I call it a brainwashing program, began, which later kind of turned into MK Ultra. All of this was the CIA. Mind control itself is Nazi science. It's old German science, MK, mind control with a K, because that's how the Germans would spell it. And so much of before they even started using drugs to brainwash our soldiers. I have a theory about that, Caleb, and I wanted to ask you your thoughts on it. The whole brainwashing affair during the Korean War, I believe, and now we know because we have a lot of declassified documents showing that was in fact a military intelligence program, that we were brainwashing our men in the armed forces to hate the communists and kill the communists. And that had to be a hard sell, I would think, so soon after World War II, because that generation grew up believing that the commies were our friends. The Soviet Union was our friend. They grew up, getting all kinds of propaganda in the movies and the newspapers and from Washington that, Joe Stalin was Uncle Joe. And a whole generation of Americans, especially men of fighting age during the Korean War, still had fond feelings for Stalin. And they still looked at the Soviet Union as an ally. So it seems to me that MK Ultra was critical to changing their minds, even if they had to literally brainwash it into them to go kill the guys who were our friends just a few years ago. What do you think of that?
Well, I've, in the last couple of years, MK Ultra has been a particular, topic of interest for me, and I've done some historical digging into it. And what I find to be the most amusing about it is that everything that was done seemed to be coming from like bad premises. If you read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks, you read The Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer.
Yeah.
The more you look into this stuff, I mean, really, the whole brainwashing MK Ultra scare in the United States started during the Korean War, when there were many Americans who got taken prisoner and in the prisoner of war camp confessed to crimes against the Korean people and announced they were communists. And of course, I mean, American media was just, horrified. How could this happen? These are good Midwestern, wholesome boys from Wisconsin and Iowa how could they have ever possibly done this? Right. And so the CIA becomes convinced that this is some kind of like Chinese voodoo, right? There's a lot of racist movies, Fu Manchu, and they thought that, the Chinese and the Koreans were doing some, they thought it was some kind of hypnosis or something, right? And that the racism really just comes across when you read it. They are convinced that this is like a magic spell or something, right? And so they start doing all kinds of research. And, Robert J. Lifton, he's a really big name in academia. He's the military psychiatrist they tap and they say, just go figure this out. And he spends years trying to figure out how this could possibly happen. And it never occurs to any of these people that maybe these guys did actually bomb innocent civilians and maybe feel bad about it. I mean, it's like, just saying, the Korean War, you're talking about 4 million people killed and all of that. And then the other thing that they discovered, which I think is probably the most important thing that came out of that, was that they discovered that the American GIs who did become communists were the most loyal, true believing, non-questioning GIs before. They were the guys who never thought America had done anything wrong, had a very black and white view of the world, that the communists were all bad and America was all good. So all they would do is they would isolate them from each other. They'd hold them separate, and then they would show them pictures of black people that had been lynched in America. They would show them images of, Emmett Till's mutilated body and, all the awful things that were going on, and say, this is what the American government, you say America's the land of the free, it does this. And their first reaction would be, of course, that's a communist lie. America would never do that, whatever. But after a while, they show them pictures. They show them that the New York Times agrees with it. And then finally, they would just crack and realize that America does indeed do bad things, and they had never comprehended that. They'd had this black and white view of the world. And that if one has a very black and white view of the world, it's not that hard to flip the light switch, right? And that's what happened. And that the guys who were already a little bit, critical, that knew about some of the bad things of the United States, that had more of a shades of gray perspective, they didn't flip. But the guys they flipped were the ones that had a very blind, all or nothing view. And then once they cracked or whatever, then they would take them out of the cell by themselves. And then they would put them in with a bunch of other people who had already become communists, and they would reward the cell based on how well they learned the communist ideology. And after a while, these guys, just like they had kind of blindly accepted the American government line, they would then come out of the jail blindly accepting the Chinese communist line. And then during the Cultural Revolution, they all came back to the United States for the most part because they were not trusted. They were viewed with suspicion. And there was a number of American, GIs who, lived in China, for the 1950s. And then once the Cultural Revolution got going in the 60s, they came back to the United States because even though they might have been loyal communists, they were viewed with suspicion. And many people noticed that many of them, when they got back to the United States, just immediately shed their communist views. And once they were back in the United States, they're like, oh, yeah, I must have been wrong about that. And that I think that kind of what was discovered in all of that research is that for a lot of people, when it comes to politics and things like that, well, we know this, right? If you are in a little town where everyone's a Republican, you're pretty likely to be a Republican. If you're in a big city where everyone is a Democrat, you're pretty likely to be a Democrat. You go, if your workplace is full of Democrats and, your family are Democrats, you're likely to be a Democrat. If your university or your workplace or your community are Republicans, you're likely to be a Republican. And that those of us who do what you and I do, Lori, and think about this stuff with a huge amount of depth, we are a very, very small minority of people, right?
Unfortunately.
And that's kind of what that whole brainwashing, there's not much to it when it really gets down to it, is that people will conform to their environment, and that people that have a very black and white worldview are much more conforming to their environment. If they have a totally white view, if you put them in a black environment, they'll flip to take the black view. And if you take them out of it, they'll take the white view. But people that have a more shades of gray view are much harder to change. And that is what gave birth to the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, which was one of the most successful programs of the CIA, which was, instead of pushing hard anti-communism, it was subsidizing certain Marxists and promoting the Frankfurt School and that was a more effective way of defeating communism, they realized. And that, rather than demonizing the civil rights movement as a communist plot, they found various black writers who were anti-communist, but also could talk about Jim Crow segregation, and promoted them. And that was a much more effective way of defeating the communists. And that ultimately had a lot to do with the color revolutions in the Cold War, because those young people that were marching to bring down the Soviet Union, bring down East Germany, if you'd asked many of them, are you supporting capitalism? They would have said no. They would have said, we're for socialism with a human face. We just want human rights. And Gorbachev really did believe that Russia, if it gave up the Soviet Union, would be allowed to become a European welfare state like Norway or Sweden. And he was convinced that the people who wanted to destroy Russia, that was the Republicans, but the Democrats were sympathetic, and that there was a huge amount of manipulating left-wing politics and manipulating the political conversation to give people different impressions. And the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't the result of just straight up anti-communism and military threat. You might hear that on Fox News. That's their version of events. It was really the result of a huge effort to infiltrate and confuse the Soviet Union politically, and to confuse the allies of the Soviet Union globally. So to the point that, that in, the constitutional crisis of 1993, barely any of the communists in the Western world supported Russia. It was, as 1993, the Soviet Union has fallen, the country's economically miserable, and the people of Russia voted for a government that would oppose austerity. The biggest party in that government was the Communist Party, but there was also some nationalist parties and others, and they were out in this, and they were elected. This was the elected government, the National Salvation Coalition, to kind of stop the destruction of Russia in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. And so then Boris Yeltsin, who was a good friend of Bill Clinton, he was the president, he dissolved the parliament. He declared a state of emergency and dissolved the parliament. And the parliamentarians refused to leave. And so the military started shelling the parliament, and people were in the streets, and hundreds of people died. And it was an awful event. And you would think,
I remember it well.
Yeah, you would think in such a situation, all the communists around the world would be rallying against Yeltsin and in support of the elected government in Russia.
Didn't.
And they didn't, because there was a huge amount of confusion and infiltration that had gone on, and that was a really important part of the Cold War. And that is, that's kind of what the Letter to Bob Avakian book is about, right? Is about how outlets like French intelligence and others have kind of weaseled their way into various communist spaces. And it's very, very confusing. Every communist government in the world supports Russia right now. Did you know this? Every single one. Yes. Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus, they all support Russia. But yet among communist parties in Western countries especially, but even some of the other communist parties, it's not a majority. And why is there this big gap between what people who call themselves communists believe and do and what actual communist governments do? Well, that gap is the result of years of infiltration and manipulation and confusion. And it's funny because this is what a lot of the conservatives are also mad about. They're mad about the woke stuff and and all of that. Well, I mean, and it's government money from the American government that paid for all of this because they wanted to create distance between the Soviet Union and American leftists. And there you go.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting to me that here we are in the third Red Scare. To me, there's no doubt that that's what's going on. All the propaganda is going in that direction. We're supposed to hate communism again. We're supposed to be afraid of China, afraid of North Korea, and all the, Russia fear mongering, even though Russia is not a communist country anymore. Soviet Union's been gone for 30 years. There's still a hell of a lot of communists in Russia. And I think a lot of them continue to vote for Putin because they think he's a good leader, even though he is not a communist. And to this day, you see polls that show that, 75% of the Russian people think that Joseph Stalin was the greatest leader they ever had. Nearly 60% of Russians want the old Soviet Union back again, which I think is probably unlikely. But I believe that's why Russia is being targeted in this new Red Scare, is our government fears that they will return to the Soviet Union or they will return to communism. They see this alliance happening with BRICS and some of the other nations against the United States. And, it all comes down to this new form of mind control. Back in the 50s and 60s with MK Ultra, the scientists had to have physical access to the person in order to brainwash them, right? They gave them drugs. They would play certain films and tapes and, program them that way. But they had to have physical access to the individual. The rest they used propaganda for in the mass media to, films, Hollywood, television, anything they could to propagandize the public to hate communism and communists. So in the 21st century, it seems to me much more pernicious what they're doing because they no longer need physical access to the person. They no longer have to slip drugs to the person, right? They use the internet.
I've got to say, those statistics you listed a little while back about, how popular Stalin is in Russia, how Soviet nostalgia is widespread. I get frustrated because I have had so many people say to me over the years when I tell them that I'm a communist, they say, "Oh, but haven't you ever talked to anyone who's lived under communism?"
Right. Yeah, I've been to Russia.
Pat myself on the head and I say, "Look at the polls. All the people, I mean, Romania, Czechoslovakia, they all say life was better. You don't know what you're talking about." But people feel like the Cuban who lives down the street from them, it represents, and the feelings of every person. And that is just, it's very frustrating, right? There is this assumption on the part of people that they know because they talked to people who fled to the United States. And it's like, we do hear a lot of exiles. The U.S. government, I believe, if you flee a communist government, you will
incentivize that.
Yeah, you get a visa automatically.
Yep.
And so, we get the anti-communists of the world come to the United States, but they're one side. And I always tell people that, if you went and interviewed Scarlett O'Hara about the U.S. Civil War, Captain Butler, I do declare, she would tell you one version of events about how Abraham Lincoln came down there and destroyed the South. It was horrible. Oh, my goodness, the slaves was all so happy before Lincoln showed up, and she wouldn't be lying. That would be her perspective.
That's right.
But there are two sides to every story. And we obviously can recognize that even though Scarlett O'Hara may have felt that way, that's not the whole experience of everyone of the Civil War. And when you talk to a Miami Cuban or you talk to somebody whose grandparents fled Ukraine in 1930, you're talking to one side of the story. And I urge people to think about that and actually realize that there are overwhelmingly done a huge amount of polls showing people in former communist countries saying that life was better before the fall of communism.
They do.
And so I find it frustrating when people arrogantly throw that out there, right?
I bet you do. And, that's one of the reasons that I enjoy having you on Strange Bedfellows, because here at Maverick News, we call ourselves the antivirus program for your mind. We are literally trying to undo decades of brainwashing of the American people and the Canadian people. We're talking 75 years of brainwashing ever since World War II, where we were told to hate all things communist and to immediately distrust it and never listen to the other side. And that's why I enjoy our dialogues, Caleb, because I think you bring a red pill, if you will, that a lot of people need to hear. Speaking of mind control, on one of your recent streams, you said something that really, really struck me, so much so that I had to write it down, and I wanted to ask you about it. You said, and I agree, because I think this is the new mind control, you said social media is the most sophisticated mind control mechanism ever invented, which scares the crap out of me because I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, it is particularly pernicious. And you look at what social media has done. I mean, the ability to control what people think, to kind of put you in a bubble where you hear certain things, to channel information to you in certain ways. It's very scary. And I mean, social media is very, very good at inciting people against each other and managing people, managing the conversation. And if you're somebody who disagrees, managing your disagreement. I mean, it's very sophisticated in what it does. But ultimately, social media is all about atomization, right? It's all about separating you from other people so that the feedback you get and the information you receive and all of that is all channeled through the algorithms. And there's nothing remotely democratic about them. And that's...
And the censorship. Yeah. It's not so much what you are allowed to see, but also the removal of things that they don't want you to see. And, as we were just talking about the way that YouTube took down 115 of your videos in a single day.
Yep.
And pretty all intense. Of them were reports for RT, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
And you know what's interesting, Caleb, was the timing of it, because it was centered around Zelensky's visit to North America, to the United States, and then to Canada. And we all see how that turned out. But they were trying their damnedest to censor any kind of pro-Russian content, Russian propaganda. They were taking down Scott Ritter videos. They took down videos with Faina that we've interviewed here on this program, and your videos, and several more. And you and I recently had a conversation on Twitter Spaces about the censorship of RFK Jr. and his censorship lawsuit against YouTube and other platforms who were trying to keep his message from getting to the American people. And just real quick, I did want to touch on that. And the fact that, we talked during that space too, you run another space about his battle with the Democratic Party, how they're not only censoring him, they're slandering him, they're rigging the primaries, they're sending him every message that they possibly can, that we don't want you in our party, we don't like your message. And I think he's finally got the message, because yesterday he put out a video and basically sent them a message right back. And here's what he had to say.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be in Philadelphia on October 9th to make a major announcement at the very birthplace of our nation. I'm not going to tell you right now exactly what that announcement will be. I can say, though, that if you've been waiting to come to one of my public events, this will be the one to come to. I'll be speaking about a sea change in American politics and what your part and my part is in that change. A lot of Americans who had previously given up any hope that real change would ever come through the American electoral process have begun to find new hope in my candidacy. And I understand the deeply felt concern that people have about the way corruption has overtaken our government. It's in the executive branch, it's in Congress, it's in the leadership of both political parties. And so some people feel a kind of cynicism alongside the hope, or they lose hope entirely because they've been disappointed so many times. I want to tell you now what I've come to understand after 6 months of campaigning. There is a path to victory. The hope we are feeling isn't some kind of trick of the mind, We all recognize that there's a genuine possibility of national transformation, and its source is the goodness of the American people. Our government may be crooked, but our people are kind, brave, and caring. That goodness is stronger than the divisions that are keeping us all apart. I see it every day on the campaign trail, and the more I see it, the more I trust it. And the more I trust it, the more the path to victory becomes visible. So how are we going to win against the established Washington interests? It's not through playing the game by the corrupt rules that the corrupt powers and the vested interests have rigged to keep us all in their thrall. Instead, we're going to have to rewrite the assumptions and change the habits of American politics. We're going to tap into a mighty surge of people power to reclaim an honest, peaceful, just, and prosperous America. So I am inviting you to join me in Philadelphia on October 9th. There I'll share with you our path to the White House and how we can all participate in healing our nation.
So it looks like all indications point to RFK Jr. is about to tell the Democratic Party to kiss his ass and leave this week and, maybe go independent or perhaps run with the Libertarian Party. There's some talk about that as well. And I just kind of wanted to ask your thoughts on that, Caleb. What do you think?
Well, as I said on that stream, if he's going to break with the Democrat Party, he needs to do it soon if he's going to be on the ballot. I think he understands that. And that's what everyone seems to be expecting, that he'll be announcing a third party run. I'm curious what party it'll be, Libertarians, People's Party, or will it just be an independent campaign? But there's a lot of energy around that campaign. And we shall see. We shall see.
That's right. And as a matter of fact, that we're going to be talking about it. We're doing a Twitter space coming up on Tuesday night, October the 3rd, in advance of his big announcement in Philadelphia. You'll be there on the panel. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have Nick Brana and Jose Vega, Anita Stewart from the Kennedy 24 campaign. And, we're just going to talk about how we're going to rejigger this thing and which way Bobby should turn. Should he turn to the Libertarian Party, who does have established ballot access in all 50 states, or go without any party affiliation at all and just go completely independent, which is certainly the hardest road. That's the road less traveled, and there's a reason it's less traveled. We're going to talk about all of that Tuesday night, and I hope you guys will join us for that. But, getting back to the news of the week, because there's so much to cover, and I know we've only got half an hour left, so I'm going to try and move through this pretty rapid fire. But, up in Canada, my friend Rick Walker had a really tough week. All of our Canadian viewers, our Canadian friends, all of a sudden, practically overnight, since that incident happened in the Canadian Parliament last Friday, social media went wild, the media went wild, and all of a sudden they all feel like Canada is being labeled as, the new Nazi Germany. People think of Canada now as a Nazi nation, which I think is, of course, not true. I work with the Canadian people on Maverick News. I talk to them and hear from them every day. I have so many friends up in Canada, and I know for a fact that's not true. The Canadian people are not fascists. Now, there's always been that element in Canada, just as there has been in this country. But when you look to our governments, Caleb, in both Canada and the United States, I would have to say that there's been a strong undercurrent of fascism. And I think in more recent years, certainly since this war began, the masks are coming off. And what we saw in Parliament last week was truly a masks off moment.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98. His name is Yaroslav Hunka. And I was going to say he's in the gallery, but I think you beat me to that. But I'm very proud to say that he is from North Bay and from my riding of Nipissing-Temiskaming. He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we thank him for all his service. Thank you.
Well, he's against Russia, so we should just clap. Because that's what mainstream media has told us, right? He was against Russia, even back in World War II, right? Oh, yeah, let's just clap, right? It's like these people never opened a history book. What side would fighting Russia in World War II put you on? Think about it now, right?
And we are to believe that every single member of the Canadian Parliament is that stupid? I mean, what the hell? Let me just show you. They said, "Thank you for your service. You're a great soldier." This is his unit, guys. This is the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, the 1st Galician Division. What you're looking at here is a recruitment poster from 1943, and Yaroslav Hunka actually published a memoir, which I think is still up online. I'm sure they're going to memory hole that pretty soon, but it's him telling his story as a youth, how he adored and looked up to Bandera's OUN, the OUNB, how he looked up to the Waffen SS and couldn't wait to join. And he did, in fact, join in 1943. That is the year that this poster was seen around his little village there in Ukraine, right? This is a typical poster of that same year of 1943. And of course, they are, apparently he's a national hero in Canada until he wasn't. Something kind of interesting happened this week. And I kind of look at this whole thing, Caleb, as a blessing in disguise. Because it was a masks off moment, it made a lot of normies out there who haven't been paying attention this whole time really take a good look at Ukraine, at the glorification of their national heroes in that country, who many of them were, in fact, Nazis, straight up Nazis, their long, long history, what Ukrainian nationalism is, and most importantly, how we imported that to the West. And, after the war, the CIA and British intelligence picked these guys out of camps, mostly in Italy, prisoner of war camps. And that is where Yaroslav Hunka was. He writes about it in his memoir, how they surrendered to the British, of course, at the end of the war. And next thing you know, he's at a camp in Italy and they find him potentially useful. And so he and many members of his Waffen unit were eventually brought to Great Britain and then to Canada. And it turns out there's a huge number of them in Canada. Canada ended up taking a lot more of the Ukrainian element and the Ukrainian war criminals than the United States did, and more than Britain did. Basically, it's not so much Canada's fault, is that we ordered them to do it. And what are they going to do? Say no when the United States CIA says, "Hey, we want you to take these guys"? They took them.
I have been seeing stuff like this for years. I'm happy to see other people noticing it for once. I remember when I first moved to New York City. This was before 2014 even. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they're on the subway and they hand out the Watchtower or whatever. And I take it because I've handed out leaflets so many times. Anyone who's handed out a leaflet, I'll take it out of respect, So I took the Watchtower and they had a memoir kind of a piece about one of the leading Jehovah's Witnesses of Argentina. And he was from Ukraine, and he'd been in a Mennonite village, but luckily he'd been oppressed by evil Stalin. But luckily the SS and the Nazis came and invaded, and he joined the SS, and he was in the SS. It was in the SS that someone recruited him to being a Jehovah's Witness. And now he lives in Argentina, and he's a leader of the Jehovah's Witnesses in Argentina. And I read that story and I was like laughing my head off. I'm like, am I the only person who can see what this is?
Yeah.
And I've been seeing stuff like that for years. And, I did an interview on Sputnik Radio, and they quoted me. I did political work in Cleveland for many years. There's a big Ukrainian American community in Parma and Parma Heights in Cleveland, right? Which is a suburb.
I didn't know that.
There's a lot of Ukrainians there. And I went to college, on the west side of Cleveland with people from that area. And, the argument, it starts with, you're a communist. Oh, well, communists are the most evil people. My family's Ukrainian. We know how evil they are. They're actually worse than Hitler. And the argument proceeds. Well, actually, did you know the Holocaust didn't really happen? Hitler's actually was just trying to protect us from the Russians. He was going to give us independence afterwards. And then,
they say.
Yeah, and what bothered me wasn't so much that they would say that, because this is an extremist exile community, like the Miami Cubans, like the Shah supporters in Sunset Park who fled. I mean, what do you expect? What bothered me was the response of other people who weren't Ukrainian when I would tell them about this. Like, these people are literally making pro-Hitler statements, and they would all say to me, well, Caleb, their people lived under communism, and communism is just so bad. There's like this pass. You know what I'm saying? There's this pass.
That's right.
Another thing that happened, which is worth noting, is in 2014, when the Euromaidan coup was happening, there was a very, very, very small communist meeting that happened in Chicago at the United Electrical Workers Hall. And it was tiny. There were like 14 people there. Okay. But the Ukrainian community of Chicago mobilized thousands of people outside to protest. And there were thousands of people outside protesting. And then several people from this Ukrainian community in Chicago went inside the United Electrical Workers Hall, locked themselves in the bathroom, and called 911 and said, the communists have taken me hostage in the building. And so the Chicago Police Department came in with guns drawn to make sure no one was being held there against their will. And that's how nutty like these folks are. And of course, were any of them arrested for making a false alarm? Of course not, stuff like that has gone on. In New York City, there is a Ukrainian building on the Lower East Side that's got, all the flags and all the pictures, Stepan Bandera, all of that in there. And that there's just been this pass because everyone just assumes, well, communists are just so bad that it's okay to be a Nazi. And it's infuriating. It's infuriating, especially when they call all kinds of people Nazis nowadays who aren't, right? Trump's not a Nazi, right?
The way that Trudeau demonized the trucker convoy last year, literally called them Nazis.
He's going to call them Nazis, and then he's going to honor an actual Nazi. It's like everyone's a Nazi except for the actual Nazis. It's really
there you go. Yes, all that. And, in addition to that standing ovation that went viral that Parliament gave to the Ukrainian Nazi, there's another video that emerged that most people have not seen yet. I want to show you this and tell you about this because I don't know if you've been following it. All this happened in 1 week up in Canada. Things are getting really weird in Canada. Speaking of convoys, there is a mysterious convoy rolling across Canada right now as we speak. Its exact goals or what they're protesting are unknown. Its destination is undisclosed. This, I should be clear that this convoy has been denounced by many people who were involved with the original Freedom Convoy of truckers protesting vaccine mandates back in 2022. A lot of those organizers say, this is weird. I want nothing to do with it. I think they're up to some violence, some trouble. And it turns out, the police are taking it very seriously. When word emerged this week that the convoy was headed to Toronto, Toronto police shut down the city center and blocked off all the roads so that the vehicles couldn't get into the city center. There was another guy who was shot by police. I'm trying to think of his name. I can't recall his name right now. I just saw it. Jermaine LeMay, 30-year-old man, was making threats against Trudeau. And he is under arrest. He wasn't killed. He is apparently in stable condition. But, the Canadian government is taking this convoy very, very seriously. Now, the original Freedom Convoy was, demonized by the Trudeau government as a bunch of fascists, bunch of Nazis. But this particular convoy, this new convoy, they call themselves the Save the Children East-West Convoy. And basically, they're coming from all over Canada to converge ultimately somewhere, but they are keeping all their plans secret. They're only in like private little Facebook groups. There's nothing on Twitter, no press releases, no interviews. It seems strange to me that an activist group who's protesting something doesn't make their goals public, what they hope to achieve, and not seeking publicity is highly unusual. But there's a video that emerged, it's pretty troubling, of convoy participants this week. I think it was just yesterday or the day before. And some of these guys are looking kind of fascist to me. I wanted to play this for you and get your thoughts because you can hear them in this clip. And they're invoking the Holodomor as an apparent call to violence against communists. I'm going to show you this and see what you think of it. This is when the convoy stopped for fuel somewhere, and I guess somebody got it on tape.
Okay.
We're able to hear that because there's a lot of wind and a lot of noise, but you could make out he was screaming about the Holodomor and the communists who are going to put us all in slavery, and the communists are the problem, is what he's saying. And the thing that's really bizarre to me, Caleb, and I'm sure to you too, is, they believe that Trudeau is a communist, that Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister and finance minister, that she's a communist, and that the source of all of their troubles in this fucked up government they have, that they're all communists, and they think Joe Biden is a communist. And, they literally believe that the communists are their enemy. I'm trying to show them, and I hope the Canadian Parliament showed them this week, that they are the opposite of communists. The government in Canada is in fact quite fascist, and that is, the communists are not the cause of all your troubles, right? But they've been brainwashed over 75 years through the Cold War and again in the 21st century to believe that Russians and the communists are the source of all of their problems, and so we have to go fight them. I'm troubled when I hear that, Caleb, because I know where it leads. I know that in the 20th century, communists were murdered in greater numbers all over the world than any other political group. The numbers are staggering. I'm not just talking about the Holocaust and World War II. I'm talking about since 1917, all over the world, even people who weren't communists, who were just maybe suspected of being a little communist or a fellow traveler, they could be taken out and shot. And they often were. So this kind of rhetoric troubles me, and I see it tied in, intermeshed with a lot of talk against the Jews and against gay people, trans people, etc. I'm not a wokeist. I'm the furthest thing from that. I'm not a communist either. I'm just a historian who's kind of in the middle, and I'm looking at all this, and it's so inverted and so backwards. And I just want to show people who, when they embrace the story of, say, the Holodomor, the Canadian government, literally, it's much more so than in the States. Up there, the Holodomor is as sacred as the Holocaust. It's one of those things you're not allowed to question in the schools and the universities. It's part of the curriculum that's taught. And the reason for that is the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. It's a group that's been around since 1940 in Canada. And over the years, they've become extremely powerful. After World War II, it was the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that was lobbying the Canadian government to bring over Waffen-SS guys like Yaroslav Hunka. They have a tremendous amount of power to this day, and they make damn sure that you don't criticize or question the Holodomor in Canada. And I just want to show you this because this is the Canadian government. These are the people that they're calling communists. What they're preaching right here is not communism, folks.
I am Alexandra Hitchie, National President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Thank you for joining us as we commemorate the 89th anniversary and launch the 90th anniversary commemorative year of the Holodomor famine genocide of 1932-1933. Every year, our communities honor the millions of innocent victims of the Holodomor, Soviet Russia's attempt to destroy the Ukrainian people. This year, the need to unite has never been more critical. Russia has launched a full-scale war against Ukraine and is committing another genocide against the Ukrainian people. We must remain one with the people of Ukraine. This year, we unite under the motto Pamiętajmy, єднаємося, переможемо. We remember, we unite, and we shall overcome. We unite in memory of all the innocent people murdered by the Soviet communist regime during the Holodomor, and we unite in honor of the Holodomor survivors whose courage in sharing their story ensured that the world knew about the Holodomor. And we unite in recognition of the bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people who today courageously defend their liberty and the freedom of Europe from Russia's tyranny.
Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. For starters, I'd like to thank the Ukrainian Canadian Congress for bringing us together to reflect on and to preserve the memories of those we lost during the Holodomor. From 1932 to 1933, the Soviet regime orchestrated a deliberate famine. Millions of innocent victims suffered and lost their lives. This was a genocide against the Ukrainian people. And it was an attempt to erase their identity and to destroy their will. But the Ukrainian people endured. Every year during Holodomor Awareness Week and on Holodomor Memorial Day, we remember those we lost and the horrific atrocities that occurred, because remembering history is often our best hope against repeating it. On this solemn anniversary, as we remember the past, we also reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its people. We will never back down in our support, and we will never forget those we've lost. Vichna yim pamyat.
In the early 1930s, Joseph Stalin and his evil communist regime committed an unspeakable act of vile hatred, the Holodomor. In what was called the breadbasket of Europe, Soviet officials went door to door, stealing crops from starving Ukrainians and destroying their homes and watching millions of innocent people starve. As part of a broader attack on Ukrainian identity and culture, these officials committed acts of brutality that were deliberately covered up by the Soviet government. Today, on Holodomor Memorial Day, we remember the victims and honor the survivors of this genocide. All Canadians join with the people of Ukrainian heritage at home and around the world to mourn the tremendous loss inflicted on generations of Ukrainian people. Sadly, today, Ukrainians must continue to fight to defend their homeland and their people against familiar evil. The unprovoked attacks from Russia have once again caused needless loss of life and brought painful suffering to Ukraine. As we remember the victims of the Holodomor, we renew our commitment to the people of Ukraine. Canada will always stand with them as they fight to preserve their heritage, their democracy, and their freedom.
On behalf of all New Democrats, we remember the over 4 million Ukrainians who were killed and millions more that suffered under the Holodomor genocide. At the time, the international community did not hold those responsible to account. And now we are seeing history repeat itself with Putin's genocidal war against Ukraine. We, as members of the international community, have a responsibility to support the courageous bravery shown by the people of Ukraine. Their resilience is an inspiration, and it is our responsibility to back up that resilience and courage with international support so they can continue to defend themselves against the purposeless, completely senseless violence perpetrated by Putin against Ukraine. Ukrainians have shown incredible resilience, and it is a testament to the strength of their community. Again, on behalf of all New Democrats, we remember the Holodomor genocide, and we commit to protecting and supporting the Ukrainian people to prevent that from ever happening again and to ensure that Ukrainians can continue to thrive in peace and in freedom.
Okay, so that is the official narrative in Canada. In Canada, they celebrate it as a national holiday. A whole week in November is Holodomor Remembrance Week, or whatever they call it. It's the official orthodoxy that their government advances. As you can see, those are the leaders of the government. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of the opposition, the Conservatives. And while these two duke it out and they're supposed to be enemies, they're in perfect agreement. And when it comes, and even the leader of the New Democratic Party there, Jagmeet Singh, they all agree Russia bad, communism bad, Holodomor happened, and you must parrot this. Now, what confuses me, and I'm going to try and explain this because I'm sure it's going to confuse the hell out of you too, as an American. The convoy people who are adopting this Holodomor narrative, let's go get the communists, boys. Let's go beat them up. Let's go do something. Let's go do some violence to those evil commies. Here's the weird part. They are in perfect agreement with Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh. They're all in agreement. They're all parroting the same narrative. Now, mind you, these are the politicians that they hate. They blame them for the lockdowns, for the vaccine mandates, for the mask mandates, for all of that stuff, as well they should. Those are the politicians responsible for it. So why are they united on this one issue? That's what we're going to try and unpack tonight. I wanted to give you the official narrative, as uncomfortable as that might be for you as a communist, hearing that kind of talk. But you have to understand that in Canadian culture, questioning the Holodomor is considered hate speech and genocide denial. There are two narratives about this tragic famine. There's the Ukrainian nationalist version, which is Canada's official orthodoxy, and then there's the Russian version or the Soviet version. I know a lot of communists say that it was a hoax. Many respected historians and academics dispute the Ukrainian version of events. But professors at Canadian colleges and universities can literally lose their jobs if they teach any other narrative, however. Books like, for example, Douglas Toddle's book, which I'm sure you've read, his landmark study, Fraud, Famine, and Fascism, the Ukrainian Genocide Myth from Hitler to Harvard. That book is forbidden in Canadian classrooms, and I doubt you could find it in the public libraries up there. So, Caleb, I wanted to get your response to the Holodomor. Was it a myth? Who's telling the truth and who's not? Or at least in your perspective, what do you think?
Well, I want to first caution people about the language that they use. Some of the words that you used there, where you said myth, hoax, I make a point of not using words like that when I talk about this, because they really would like to equate what is alleged about Ukraine in the 1930s with the Holocaust. And to fit their narrative, they would then like to equate those of us who question it with people who deny the Holocaust. And so I am very, very careful to talk about this in a sensible way. Was there a famine in the 1930s, 1932, 1933 in the USSR, largely affected Ukraine? Absolutely there was. Were there a lot of innocent people who died? Absolutely. But you have to understand that in Ukraine, there were famines all the time before the Russian Revolution. Millions died regularly in the famines that happened, and that it was the Soviet Union that brought tractors to the Ukrainian countryside, that mechanized agriculture and created the modern agricultural system that electrified the Ukraine. I mean, it's like to blame the Soviet system for one famine that happened when it was the Soviet system that made that area modern, industrialized, wiped out illiteracy, caused the population to greatly expand due to access to healthcare, and that's just ridiculous. Now, in terms of other things, when this famine happened, what happened was that there was a natural crop shortage, and in light of that, the Soviet Union had to quickly reverse its policy. There was a group of peasants who owned their own land, rich peasants. Their nickname was the kulaks.
The kulaks.
Because they had employees and they would punch them, right? And they were known for being quite ruthless with their employees. They were called the kulaks. And the policy of the Soviet government in the 1920s, as they were rebuilding the country from the Russian Civil War, in which millions of people also died because the country was invaded by 15 different countries, their policy had been kulaks, enrich yourself, meaning that they promoted private agriculture. However, when this famine happened, there was a lot of hunger because there were food shortages. And these kulaks had a lot of extra food, and they were refusing to share it. And so among the peasantry in Ukraine, you had many of the poorer peasants who were ganging up on the kulaks and lynching them and killing them and taking their crops. And Stalin saw this happening. And he said, okay, we can have a big, ugly bloodbath where the poor peasants all gang up on the rich peasants and steal their food, or I can send the army in and we can create a collective agricultural system very formally. And that is what happened, right? Is that in order to prevent a bloodbath, in order to prevent the poor peasants from murdering the kulaks, Stalin sent the army in to do it in a formal way rather than a mob violence, chaotic way. And that in the context of a food shortage, they rapidly transitioned from a private farming system to a collective farming system. And it was bad. And I must add, though, that this didn't just happen in Ukraine. This happened in Moldova. This happened in Russia. This happened all over the Soviet Union.
And the United States, by the way, during the Dust Bowl. I'm an Oklahoma girl. I've heard all the stories about the Dust Bowl and how our people were dying of starvation too, because like you said earlier, we had no food stamps. There was no food relief. At that same time, we were going through a Great Depression. A lot of our people were dying of starvation too.
Right. And that, at the time that this happened, there was criticism of the Soviet government. People said that they mismanaged, that because their economic policy had been promoting private farming and then they so rapidly switched, that caused a lot of chaos. That's all legitimate. You can argue that there were things that Stalin or the Soviet leadership did that made things worse. That's all fair game, and I'm open to any of that. But the narrative of Ukrainian nationalists is that this whole famine happened because Stalin just hated Ukrainians, because the Ukrainian people love freedom, and he just hated the Ukrainian people. So he plotted together with the Soviet officials to destroy the great Ukrainian nation. That's bullshit. The reason Ukraine has a written Ukrainian language is because of the Soviet Union. The borders of Ukraine were drawn and then expanded by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union electrified Ukraine. The Soviet Union wiped out illiteracy in Ukraine. I mean, the Soviet Union did a lot to promote the Ukrainian nationality, right? There were no borders on Ukraine before the Russian Revolution. There was just a part of the Russian Empire people called Ukraine, right? But it was Lenin and his position that every nationality should have its own written language, should have a seat in the Soviet House of Nationalities that existed in the original Soviet Constitution. It was really the concept of a Ukrainian nation was created by the Soviet Union, and they did a lot to promote Ukrainian art, to promote Ukrainian culture, to promote the Ukrainian language. And this whole narrative where the Soviet Union was trying to destroy the Ukrainian nationality is just bullshit. And I mean, if you read history, if you look at the Soviet policy, it's just bullshit. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, one of his big criticisms of the Soviet Union is he argues the Soviet Union did this kind of thing too much and that it divided them. They should have been focusing on what held the peoples of the Soviet Union together rather than promoting all these individual nationalities. So, it's one thing to say that some of the Soviet policies could have been done better, but it's another thing entirely to say that there was a plot to wipe out one particular nationality. That's just not the case. That's just not what happened. And there was malnutrition all over the USSR during these years, but it was the Soviet system that cured starvation in the Soviet Union by building a modern farming system, by bringing tractors to the countryside. I mean, you're blaming the system that cured starvation for starvation, something that happened before they came to power all the time. It's just not a logical interpretation of events. And it depends on an anti-communist bias, and it's just, it's unfortunate. And the way they want us to talk about it, they want us to use words like hoax or myth. And I'm not going to do that because there really was a famine and a lot of people did die. And, one thing I was taught when I went to university, they said, well, it had to have been a crime against humanity because they sold grain. They exported grain while the famine was going on. Is that true? Absolutely. And you know what they did with the grain? They used it to buy tractors. And I cannot imagine. We have no idea what the Soviet Union went through. You have to remember 15 countries invaded after the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War. They were barricaded. They couldn't get medicine. And there was mass death all over the USSR. Millions of people were dying. And the Soviet government sat there and they had to say, okay, now millions of our people are dying and there's going to be lots of death because of food shortages. Total. That's just going to happen. But if we take some of the grain and we sell it, we can then get tools so that we can have tractors and we can mechanize our agriculture and not have this happen again. Is it worth it? I can't imagine making those kind of decisions. Can you? We can't relate to that. You and I cannot relate to that kind of situation at all.
And there's something I want to add to that because I think it's an important factor to consider. When you talk about the Russian Civil War after the Bolshevik Revolution, not only were they invaded by all these other countries, they were also being attacked from within. You had the Ukrainian nationalist movement there in Ukraine. You had the horrible pogroms, which was a genocide in 1919, 20, and 21, where Jews, Poles, and Soviets and communists were murdered, slaughtered en masse. And there may have been, I have heard some historians advance this theory, and I wanted to ask you about it, if there was some political aspect to the Holodomor, because we know that those areas where Holodomor happened, they were a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism, and that Stalin did apparently arrest and deport many of them because he was concerned that they were going to overthrow the Soviet Union. They were certainly planning on it.
Well, I think there were people who were engaging in armed violence against the state. I mean, it was clear that in the light of the food shortages that were caused by natural disaster, by natural droughts, etc., that there were food shortages, and the poor peasants were ganging up on the wealthy peasants, and it was like a war in the countryside, essentially. And the Red Army was sent in to make sure that things were done in an orderly fashion, and it didn't become an episode of mob violence and killing. And
it didn't turn into those pogroms all over again that they'd seen before.
Yeah. And that, I mean, it was obviously an awful situation that neither you or I can ever relate to. Mass death on that level, starvation. But again, it drives me crazy because this fits in with this trope, right? There's two things about this I want to say. First thing, right, is that it fits in this trope, and I hear this over and over. Well, communism leads to people starving. No, communism cured people starving. It cured people starving in Russia. It cured people starving in China. It made both those countries industrial countries. And in, parts of Africa, parts of South America that are still under capitalist domination, there's still starvation. So, it's like, how do they miss the forest for the trees? It's like the whole history of both Russia and China since the time the communists took power has been rising up and industrialized. And for them to just point, well, there was a famine here, so communism causes starvation. It's just like, it's infuriating. So there's that.
I can imagine.
The second thing is generally the numbers you get, these big numbers of deaths that you get from Holodomor or the Great Leap Forward in China or whatever. The way it's presented, especially by the libertarian or right-wing anti-communist crowd, is they say, well, communism killed a million people, right? And it's like, Lori, I think your dad was a prosecutor, right? And if someone's on trial for murder, and you accuse them of murder, you have to explain how they did it. You can't just say it happened, right? You have to have evidence. You have to have facts. You have to, well, no, it's just they killed this many million people. Well, no, they possibly had an economic policy that had problems that led to food shortages, something that happened before the revolution all the time, something they eventually got rid of. And, we all know what the Nazis did. The Nazis rounded up people on the basis of their race, put them on trains, took them to camps, and gassed them to death on the basis of their race.
But not just race. I have to bring this up every time we talk about, but the Nazis only killed Jews. Not true. The driving force that guided both the Ukrainian nationalists and the Nazis was anti-communism. And that's what a lot of people today do not understand. And they should understand it, because I believe, as a lot of historians believe, I don't know if you share this belief, that Nazism in its essence is anti-communism, and anti-communism is fascism.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. And there's nothing that the Soviet government ever did that you can equate with what the Nazis did, right? People went to labor camps. That was awful. A lot of people who shouldn't have been there were in those labor camps, but most of them left after a year or two, and they lived, right? There were no gas chambers in the gulags, okay? Right. Furthermore, a famine that's caused by a failed agricultural policy, I'm pretty sure the Soviet officials didn't want there to be food shortages in the Soviet Union. They weren't intentionally doing it, but they were trying to raise their country up and industrialize. And under certain circumstances, there was a food shortage. That's not the same as the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust was intentional murder, okay? And bad economic policy or labor camp that people leave after 1 or 2 years. You cannot equate those things. You just can't do it. And that an attempt to equate those two things because you do some math is just not accurate. And it only passes because people have this anti-communist bias. People want to believe it. People are primed to believe it because that's what we're all told is communism is evil. Communism failed everywhere. and people believe it. And if you actually look into the facts of the situation, even if you accept the idea that the Soviet leaders, it was their mismanagement, it was their decisions that led to everything that went wrong, even if you accept that there was pure malicious intent on the part of Stalin and leadership, you still can't equate a crime of genocide with a crime of economic mismanagement. You can't do that, right? And and it frustrates me. And I mean, you sent me some articles, and I know about the Toggle book and other things, and I think those books all make a great point. I really recommend Blood Lies by Dr. Grover Furr. I really love that book. Yeah, because he shows that Timothy Snyder, who's the head of the Russian Studies Department at Yale, is a bullshit artist, and that a lot of his sources don't say what he claims they say. One of his books, he claims that, so during the Red Army frequently raped Ukrainian women. And his source, which is in Russian, which is in the Russian archives, which no one's going to go check because no one has access to it. Well, he went and checked it. The source was a Red Army soldier who did that being put on trial for doing it and given the death penalty. So how does that prove that this frequently happened? No, it's one time it happened and the guy got the death penalty for doing it. That's, not, and that there's a lot of bluffing like that. He says, well, according to the Soviet archives, Red Army soldiers frequently raped Ukrainian women. And then his source says something completely different. Right. And that, well, he's got an anti-communist bias. He's telling the American audience what they're primed to believe. He's telling the anti-communists what they want to hear. So no one bothers to fact check it. That's
one of those things that drives me nuts, Caleb. As a historian, I have come to see for myself that there's so much dishonest scholarship and in academia, especially during the Cold War. You had our university professors in the States, just as they do still in Canada today, teaching us a narrative that it often, when you really examine it and you hold it up under the light and you fact check it and check against other sources, it doesn't hold up. It falls apart. And when you look at Timothy Snyder's book and Robert Conquest's book about the Holodomor, a lot of this really started in the 80s. In fact, most of us had never heard of Holodomor until the 1980s. And that's when all these books started to come out and it kind of infected our culture. Can you talk a little bit about that and why we didn't really hear anything about Holodomor until all of a sudden in the 80s? And there's this explosion of books and what I consider to be dishonest academic scholarship on that subject.
I mean, it served a political purpose with the rise of neoconservatism, I think, with the ascendancy of figures like Ronald Reagan and such, where anti-communism became the basis of their argument. The idea that the USA is spreading freedom and these evil dictators are all around the world. And, I mean, it served, there were changes going on in U.S. politics at that time, with the defeat of Jimmy Carter and the rise of Ronald Reagan and the military-industrial complex, and with the Soviet Union starting to retreat, especially with the rise of Gorbachev. And, we were seeing the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, the liberalization and market reforms coming in that set the stage for the color revolutions across Eastern Europe, and that politics was shifting. And part of that was a change in the narrative and the conversation. And that, the communist world was very divided during those years. And China was moving in a more market direction. So there was a feeling that, yeah, and also it was a way of, you can't separate it from neoliberal economics, because neoliberal libertarian economics is predicated on the lie that communism's never worked anywhere, which is what I heard my whole life. Honestly, if I hadn't been told that, I probably wouldn't have become a communist. But it was just discovering that contradicted basic economic data, that all the statistics showed the Soviet Union had huge achievements in terms of industrialization and raising living standards, and China and Cuba and Libya under Gaddafi. It was seeing that, right? That forced me to look into the facts, and I realized how much we'd been lied to. But it was really, in order to, you can't really push the idea that you must privatize everything. You got to have prisons for profit. You got to have schools for profit. We can privatize the military with military contractors. The market is always better. The only way you can really push that logic is you have to get people to somehow believe that any alternative to the market, any attempt to have a socialist society has always made life worse. right? You really need that. And as they were pushing austerity and neoliberalism in the Western capitalist countries, the idea that socialism has never had any successes anywhere was a really big part of that. You know, Margaret Thatcher, you know, she said her whole thing about socialism, you know, fails because eventually you run out of other people's money. And I hear that and I just want to slap myself in the face. I'm like, wait a second, you know, did they run out of other people's money in the Soviet Union? Is China running out of other people's money? It's like, that's not what socialism is. Socialism isn't taxation, right? Socialism is not, you know, taxation, but that is what neoliberal economists want us to believe, right? The post office and Stalin are both communism, and that's why we must privatize everything. You know, that's the argument, right?
Yes,
You know, if Medicare is just like what Stalin did, and we're all going to die, and that's how they pushed austerity, cutting public spending, cutting food stamps, cutting social assistance programs. It was by creating an atmosphere centered around anti-communism. And I really do think those changes that you're talking about in the 80s, where suddenly, you know, there was all this talk, it was more about rolling back the welfare state in the West than anything that was going on in the developing world.
Interesting. I never looked at it that way. That does make a lot of sense, because that's what our government was in fact doing. And that's when we saw the death of Detroit, the death of our industrial base that had made us great. It was, you know, the destruction of all those things that the Roosevelt coalition built in the 1930s, and the New Deal. And, you know, as we discussed earlier in the show, if you have unemployment insurance, if you have Social Security, if you have Medicare, all of those things you can thank a little bit of socialism for. I'm just saying, it wouldn't have happened without their efforts, without their agitation, without their activism. President Roosevelt, who was by no means a communist, was actually convinced that these things would be good for the country, good for America. And I believe that the decades of prosperity that we saw after World War II, where, you know, so much of the middle class was built on that Roosevelt model, which came from a little bit of communism. What do you say?
And let me add, what should have happened then? Right? If communism is responsible for all the problems the Soviet Union had, what should have happened then in the 90s? Then we should have seen a huge boom, right? Because then they had capitalism. They sold the state assets off to the highest bidder. The IMF and the World Bank went in there. The 90s should have been a paradise, according to this logic, because all of the problems the Soviet Union had were all caused by communism, and capitalism is always the answer. But what happened in the 90s? Shock therapy economics caused a mass epidemic of death and destruction. I mean, and read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, read Europe Since 1989 by Philip Thayer, read the history of neoliberalism, and look at what the implementation of radical free market policies in Russia in the 90s resulted in, and what it resulted in Bolivia, what it resulted in Chile, what it resulted in country after country in South America during the 80s and 90s as well. Neoliberal free market economics tends to create mass starvation, death, and poverty. And that is something that this conversation about the evils of communism kind of distracts from. I went to Ecuador when I was 12 years old in 1999 in the middle of a man-made famine. And I saw all kinds of desperately poor, starving people. And all that poverty and starvation was caused by the fact that Ecuador had been forced by the IMF to abandon its currency and adopt the US dollar as its currency and sell its oil industry that had been nationalized and sell it off to American oil companies. And then on top of that, the Asian markets collapsed. And that was engineered by the United States. There was the collapse of the Asian markets where the USA pulled all its money out of Singapore and all these places. And that, combined with what they called at the time El Nino, which was some weather patterns, people think it now may have had something to do with global warming. You saw hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Ecuador or dying or starving. And I was in Ecuador. I landed in Quito, Ecuador at the airport, and the streets were all full of these desperately poor, starving people from the countryside who were there in the cities trying to get some food. You know, why don't we talk about that? Russia's population decreased by 10% between 1996 and 2006. 10%. 1 in 10 people either died or left the country. The suicide rate skyrocketed. The drug addiction rate skyrocketed. If you went to any of the subways, you'd see a bunch of elderly people who had no pension and no social security trying to sell you their clothes so they could have some food to eat with, trying to sell you yesterday's newspaper so they could have some food to eat with. Neoliberal economics has a huge body count. And no one wants to talk about that because we're told, well, it's communism that has the body count. But we shouldn't be surprised because neoliberal economics had a body count when the British imposed it on India in the 1800s. It had a body count in many African countries. It had a body count in China. The Opium Wars, 2 Opium Wars were waged to force free trade and free market economics onto China. And it resulted in at least 100 million deaths, according to the statistics the Chinese Communist Party has assembled, because it prevented China from developing its own industries. It kept the country divided. It kept, and 1928, Edgar Snow visited China, and millions of people were starving to death in a famine. And the reason this famine was happening is because the fields that should have been growing food were growing opium poppies for the British drug trade. And because they had no strong central government, there was food in other parts of the country and there was starvation in other parts. And the government was not well organized enough to take the food, surplus from one area to another area. There wasn't a strong central government. These regional warlords were doing one thing and the central government was doing another thing, and there was chaos. And so they couldn't mobilize famine relief. They even had enough food, but people were still starving. Free trade, free market capitalist economics has led to millions of deaths, but those deaths don't count for some reason, right? Mm-hmm. Those deaths are never calculated. That's just something we don't think about. But if anyone dies in a communist country for any reason, if there's ever a food shortage, if there's ever a problem, that's purely murder by communists. That's
propaganda win for the West, and they're going to use it in any way that they possibly can.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to what's going on in Canada this week, and something I wanted to sort of to put a punctuation mark on that, because I know we're running out of time, but
yes,
it's crazy to me. As much as they love to demonize Russia and they say that the people don't have any freedom over there, I just want to say that we have a large Canadian audience at Maverick News. The channel is based in Ontario, Canada. Most of our viewers, I'd say about 70%, are Canadian, but tonight's show is not being seen by our Canadian viewers. Unfortunately, we decided that it would not be a good idea to stream this out to the Canadian channels in our Maverick News network, which is a global network, because of the sensitive topic of the Holodomor, which thou shalt not question in Canada. We don't want to be accused of hate speech or genocide denial, which is actually a thing in Canada. So it's a suppression of free speech and free thought in Canada. Yet this show is going out tonight to our Russian channels in our network. So they have more free speech in Russia, apparently, than they do in Canada. And to wrap this conversation up, and I appreciate you going overtime with me because it's just so good. I didn't want to cut you off. It's just such an important conversation to have. But I wanted to ask you, now the big debate in Canada after Nazigate is, what do we do about it? I mean, they're finally admitting that Canada has a Nazi problem, and it's a big Nazi problem, and it's been there a long time. Only now are they facing it, admitting it, and most of all, they're going to have to take some action to do something about it. Now, there's calls for the resignation of Justin Trudeau. There's calls for the resignation of Chrystia Freeland. There are even calls for every single member of the Canadian Parliament, all 338 of them who were on their feet, clapping like trained seals last week, to resign or to dissolve the government completely and call elections. What do you think that Canada should do about it?
Well, I think now is a great time to have a conversation about how the United States basically forced this on Canada. The United States, led Canada into the position on Ukraine that it takes, and that maybe Canada should be more concerned about its own sovereignty and its own national interest than, a crusade against Russia on the other side of the world.
That's a great answer. And, Rick and I were talking about that, I think, last week. where he was talking about how Canada's always been so subservient to the United States because the way he puts it, we're right next door to a superpower. We don't have much of a military. What choice do we have? We kind of have to accommodate whatever the United States wants. And I said to him, yeah, sort of like Austria did when they were next door to Nazi Germany. What choice did they have?
Yeah, indeed.
It's not so unlike that.
All right. Well, thank you
one
very
last
much.
thing before you
Okay.
go. If you could
Okay.
spare me 5 more minutes. When we're talking about solutions, believe it or not, well, you know this, but there are many in Canada and the United States on both the left and the right who say that the answer, the way to fix it, is we have to invade Canada and liberate them from their Nazi government. And so, we've got people like Tucker Carlson, who I have a great deal of respect for, but even Tucker's on board with this. He said we need a Bay of Pigs style invasion of Canada. There's Lieutenant Steve Rogers on the right, who's started this SOS letter writing campaign from Canadians to the United States Congress saying, please help us, come liberate us. Our country is being held hostage. And even on the left, you've got a guy who claims to be a communist, Jackson Hinkle, a MAGA communist, if you will. He is also endorsing this idea. And I just want to play you a quick clip of why a so-called communist thinks it's a good idea for the United States military to invade Canada.
With
Here we go.
Miss Russia, right?
I'm dating Miss Universe Russia. Beautiful woman.
How did that happen?
I slid in her DMs.
They said Putin hooked you up with her. Was that real?
I wish that was the case. I
No,
love
it
Putin. But I've never met Putin. I'd love to meet Putin. I sent him a letter at the start of the war. I don't know if he got it.
You met Ye though, right?
I FaceTimed him.
Oh, you FaceTimed
Wow.
him.
How did that happen?
He was running for president. A lot of people know that. And his campaign didn't go very far. I think he kind of nipped that in the bud. But some friends of mine were leading his campaign and involved with the campaign. And something I'm really passionate about, like our founding fathers in the United States believe that, you guys know what manifest destiny is, like westward expansion. All that stuff.
I haven't heard it. I haven't heard it before.
When we had like the colonies in the United States, or it wasn't the United States, we had British colonies. The Brits didn't want us to expand past like Eastern mountains into Western America and develop Western America and tap into all those vital resources, because they were fearful that those colonies would break off and form a country, a nation state. But the founding fathers all wanted to not only extend all the way to California, they wanted to take it all the way to Mexico, invade Canada and liberate Canada and bring that into the United States. And I think that we should do it. I think that we should invade Canada. Why are we spending this money on Ukraine when we could literally have Canada? We've spent $200 billion on Ukraine. For what? For what? Most of it's being siphoned off into like black markets and offshore accounts, and Zelensky's buying these mansions in Italy and Miami, Lake Como, wherever. What if we just took Canada? It's a nice country. They have a lot of oil, and it would just basically achieve the American dream.
So you want to send troops to Canada and totally take over?
Yeah, I think
do you think we have to fight Canada, or they probably just be like, here, you guys can have it?
Well, but long story short, that's what I was discussing with Kanye, because he liked the idea. He liked the idea of invading.
I never even thought about invading Canada, because we more so like cater to them, but they're like, our friend. We don't really mess with them.
Well, there's like two factors to it, because right now there's that Trudeau government in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's so sad to see what's happening there. Censorship is bad in America, but in Canada,
it's terrible.
If you say the wrong thing, you could literally be fined or imprisoned.
Wow.
And I'm not making that up. It's very real. And in addition to that, you also have the age-old fight between Britain and the U.S. Britain financed Canada in the War of 1812 when they burned down the White House. So Canada has been used as a proxy by the British Empire against the U.S. for years. And it seems like we're friends with the Brits right now, but a lot of top American political elites are not. Like Trump hates Britain in the city of London. So I think that it would be, just to avoid any further wars in the future, we should just go in and take it.
Oh, my head hurts. Can you make any sense of that?
Well, clearly, this is the greatest Marxist of all time. I mean, this is like hearing Karl Marx himself or Vladimir Lenin. I mean, this is probably what Che Guevara would say on the situation. If Mao or Stalin or Gus Hall or William Z. Foster were here, I mean, they would sound exactly like that. We know that. These are the most well thought out, articulate thoughts, are putting forward a genuine communist analysis. I'm sure that Jackson came to that conclusion after a lengthy study of dialectical materialism and Marxism. So, if he probably knows way more about this than I do. So I just want to defer to Jackson Hinkle. If you can argue with him, it's like, this is clearly a sophisticated, well thought out position that he has. So, why argue with him?
I think not. It's astonishing to me, really, that any nation, anywhere, especially after the last 20 some odd years that we've invaded country after country and just demolished everything in our path and ruined Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and on and on and on. Why would any country in the world actually beg the United States to come liberate them? Guys, I don't think it's going to work out the way you think it's going to work out. I'm just saying, I don't think it's the answer.
Yeah. I don't want to speculate too much about why he might be saying that, but, generally my understanding of the role of communists in America is that we don't advocate the American imperialist government invading more countries. That's
what I thought.
It doesn't mean we endorse the Canadian government, and I share your outrage about what they are and what they're done. But I really, it makes me wonder, because there are, as you said, there are certain American forces that are talking about this and such, and there are certain forces in Canada that are calling for this, and it seems like we have a certain social media personality who's calling for this. And I think I would assume that him saying that has a lot more to do with those forces and his relationship with them than it has to do with communism.
I think you're exactly right, my friend. Exactly right. And I know we can't dig into that further because we're way over time, but thank you so much for the extra time tonight. What an amazing conversation with you, as it always is.
Thank you.
Before we go, just tell folks where people can get your new book and where they can find you and follow you and support you.
I'm on YouTube. I'm with the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. And the new book is Letter to Bob Avakian, available wherever books are sold. Check it out. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
It is always a pleasure, Caleb. We'll see you back here again soon. And we'll see you guys back here next Saturday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Strange Bedfellows. Good night, everyone.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.